When I was in college, I attended a class called Temporal Work and Relationships in the Home. In that class, we studied two cultures. The first culture was a primitive tribe. And in that tribe, all the daily lessons, all the values that they passed on to their children were passed on in the context of the work that they did. The men would take the young men out and they would sing and they would teach them. Around the fire at night, they would tell stories. The women would take the younger children and while they were either cooking or fishing, would teach them their stories. There was a blend between their religion, their values, what it meant to belong to a family, and also what they had to do to survive. In many ways, wilderness therapy is taking us back to that place. In our culture, sometimes it's hard to teach the lessons that we want to pass on. We're not always on the farm, so the lesson of what you sow is what you reap is not an easy one to pass on to our children. So wilderness therapy, primitive living wilderness therapy, takes it back to that place. It's in the context of our struggles sometimes that we learn the valuable lessons of who we are and what it means to belong. And so I think sometimes it's funny when we call wilderness a metaphor, because it's strange to think about sitting in the woods without electronics, without all this virtual reality is not the real world. And yet with our screens, our cell phones, our smartphones, with all of that, we call that the real world. So in some ways, wilderness therapy is a visiting of the real world. And it's really, for me, a place to learn to feel. I think without the distractions that our lives are so filled up with, I think we can more easily access our feelings and come to know ourselves. And so that's an important part of it. I think more than when we started Evoke Therapy years ago, removing all of our digital influences in our lives is important. Somebody called wilderness therapy a digital detox. And so it's camping, it's hiking, it's making fire, it's cooking over an open flame in a small group, moving from place to place. And while we might say it's a metaphor for life, I might suggest that it's actually more like real life. It helps us to get in touch with our authentic selves because we don't have things taking us out of our reality, if you will. So wilderness therapy doesn't need to be thought of as a program of last resort. It doesn't need to be thought of like it was many years ago as simply a wake-up call. I think it's a return to our spirituality. Abraham Maslow said in his famous hierarchy of needs that at the bottom of the pyramid, there is the survival needs, food, water, and shelter. And then as you move up the pyramid, he talks about more psychological needs, what it means to belong, what it means to be a self. And wilderness therapy tips that upside down, mingles it all together and says it's sometimes the contrived or the uncontrived lessons. Sometimes it's just the life that teaches us. And when we contrive lessons, we find that the overall impact of wilderness therapy diminishes. So for us, it becomes its own lesson. Sometimes you don't have to do a lot of lecturing and teaching. Sometimes walking in the front door of therapy is not the most effective way. Sometimes walking in the side or the back door is effective. Sometimes the lecture is the hike. Sometimes the lecture is the rainstorm and the thunder and the lightning. Sometimes that removal, that distance from home is an opportunity to reconnect with yourself, which gives you a greater capacity to connect back to your family. So families that worry about the distance as a part of wilderness therapy come to learn that the first ingredient in a healthy relationship is a whole self. And wilderness therapy does just that. It helps one find one's whole self. So it's a different way of thinking about wilderness therapy than we've thought about it in previous years. It's a different way of thinking about therapy than we've thought about. Because all of our pain, all of our trauma, all of our wounds aren't stored in the prefrontal cortex. They're not stored in the verbal parts of our brain. They're stored throughout our brain and in the unconscious parts. And wilderness therapy helps access that. Children are outside of their comfort zone. Participants stretch themselves and they find a new version of themselves and they fall in love with it. And that's really the way that I like to think of wilderness therapy.